It's 1983 and video games are in sharp decline in North America. The video game industry here is crashing hard. Arcades are closing and home console sales are plummeting. It seems like the age of video games might be over before it ever really begins. But then, a Japanese company named Nintendo steps in with a dream and a plan to revolutionize home entertainment. Cue in the Nintendo Entertainment System, our NES, a console that didn't just save Nintendo, but arguably saved our entire video game industry. We'll start by diving into the creation of the Nintendo Famicom itself, learning what inspired Nintendo to create their iconic console. As the story progresses, we'll learn how Nintendo introduced the Famicom to North America, looking at all the obstacles they overcame to bring what would eventually become the Nintendo Entertainment System to the masses. So grab your controllers, blow on those cartridges, and get ready to relive the magic as we embark on another trip down memory card lane. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. I hope these words find you well. Hello and welcome to the 203rd episode of our Video Game History Podcast, a trip down memory card lane. Each week, we'll tell you a story relevant to the current week in gaming history. It can be about a game or the people that have created it. It can be about a console or the technology that brought it to life. We often bring it all together and talk about the companies that make our hobby, video games, a reality. While telling you each story, we hope to teach you something new about the topic, what it took from the world as its inspiration, or what it gave back to the world in its legacy. Today, super excited, we're going back to the mid 80s, an absolute pivotal time in gaming history, to explore the creation of the Nintendo Entertainment System, which was originally released in Japan as the Nintendo Famicom on July 15th, 1983. I'm David Casson, and as always, I'm joined by my co-host, who still believes that blowing into cartridges makes everything better. He's my brother, Rob Casson. Rob, how many times did you have to blow into your games to get them working?
Not very many.
No, not very many at all.
No, didn't really use a lot of cartridge based games. It was all discs, and then it was either it works or it doesn't, and you're SOL.
You don't blow on CD-ROMs?
No, you just lick them.
You just
Give 'em
lick
good old
them.
licking.
You.
Yep.
Well, you're about to get a fan base you didn't ask for.
I got plenty of fan bases. That's what hold my fan up.
Oh my goodness. All right. Well, I have a story I'm very excited for today. I'm very excited to tell all about the NES. That is my earliest gaming memory, and it is an incredibly fascinating story as far as I'm concerned.
Well, before that, let's hit our current week in gaming history, Dave.
Yeah, tell us what else has happened this week.
Well, kicking it off on July 20th, 1990, Metal Gear 2 Solid Snake was released for the MSX2 in Japan, developed and published by Konami. Directed by Hideo Kojima, this sequel to the original Metal Gear significantly advanced the stealth action genre with more complex gameplay, enhanced enemy AI, and a deeper narrative. Players controlled Solid Snake on a mission to infiltrate Zanzibar land, rescue a kidnapped scientist, and stop the development of a new Metal Gear weapon. The game introduced innovations such as crawling to avoid detection, a radar system to monitor enemy movements, and a variety of gadgets, laying the groundwork for future titles in the series. Metal Gear 2 Solid Snake was acclaimed for its intricate design and storytelling, cementing its place as a classic in video game history. On July 14th, 1992, Nintendo released Mario Paint for the Super Nintendo Entertainment System. This innovative game utilized the SNES mouse accessory, allowing players to create digital art, animations, and music with a simple and intuitive interface. Mario Paint featured various tools and activities, introducing a painting program, a music composer, and a fly-swatting minigame. It was praised for its creativity and educational value, providing a fun and engaging way for users to explore their artistic abilities. Mario Paint became a beloved title for its unique approach to gaming and its ability to inspire creativity in players of all ages, leaving a lasting impact on the genre of creative video games. And we covered it back in episode 49. So if you want to learn more about Mario Paint, go check it out.
Yes, the weird Mario games. Kind of weird Mario games. That's
Oh,
definitely
yeah.
something different.
It's different, but it was fun.
It was fun.
A year later, on July 14th, 1993, Nintendo released Super Mario All Stars for the SNES. This compilation game featured enhanced 16-bit versions of four classic Mario titles: Super Mario Bros., Super Mario Bros. The Lost Levels, which was previously unreleased outside of Japan, Super Mario Bros. 2, and Super Mario Bros. 3. Each game was graphically and audibly updated to take advantage of the SNES's capabilities, providing a fresh experience for new and returning gamers. Super Mario All Stars was praised for its high quality remakes of these beloved games, offering improved visuals, sound, and gameplay while preserving the original charm and challenge. The collection became a bestseller and is celebrated as one of the finest game compilations, highlighting the enduring legacy of the Mario franchise. On July 18th, 2002, keeping up with our theme, Super Mario Sunshine was released for the Nintendo GameCube in Japan. Developed and published by Nintendo, this platformer follows Mario as he travels to the tropical Isle Delfino for a vacation, only to find the island polluted and Mario himself framed for the mess. To clear his name and clean the island, Mario uses a device called the Flood, which stands for Flash Liquidizer Ultra Dousing Device, which allows him to spray water to clean up goop, defeat enemies, and solve puzzles. Super Mario Sunshine was praised for its vibrant graphics, inventive level design, and the introduction of the Flood, which added a new layer of gameplay mechanics to the classic platforming formula. The game's sunny, open world environments and engaging challenges made it a beloved title on the GameCube and an essential part of the Super Mario series. And apparently, this was a busy week for releases for Mario fans throughout the years.
It was, for sure.
And last up, on July 16th, 2003, the only episode we have ever changed, Star Wars Knights of the Old Republic, or KOTOR, was released for the Xbox, developed by BioWare and published by LucasArts. Set thousands of years before the events of the Star Wars films, this role playing game allowed players to explore the galaxy as a customizable protagonist caught in the struggle between Sith and Jedi. Praised for its deep narrative, complex characters, and engaging gameplay, KOTOR featured moral choices that influenced the storyline and the player's alignment with the light or dark side of the Force. The game introduced turn based combat mechanics and a rich, immersive universe filled with lore and side quests. Knights of the Old Republic received critical acclaim and numerous awards, solidifying its status as one of the greatest RPGs of its time and a landmark title in the Star Wars gaming franchise.
Go ahead. Tell me I'm missing out.
It's a fantastic game. If you haven't played it like Dave, go play it because it's fantastic. So good. And with that, I think it's time we talk about today's topic, Dave.
After graduating college, Masayuki Uemura found a job working at the Sharp Corporation selling solar cell batteries and other related products. He ended up selling Sharp's photocell technology to several companies, and among them was Nintendo. As part of the sales process, he had the privilege of discussing projects with Nintendo's main toy designer, a man we've seen before, Gunpei Yokoi, and they discussed the possibility of using Sharp's solar cells on new and interesting products. They wanted to utilize their light detecting capabilities on the solar cells to create something new. This idea was to produce electronic light gun games where the gun would shoot a beam of light at the photocells, which would act as the targets. This sales meeting and their relationship ended being life-changing for Uemura, who ended up being hired by Nintendo in 1971 as an electrical engineer. Their project that they discussed at the time would inevitably turn into the laser clay shooting system, an arcade game that was released in January of 1973. Now, we've talked about that time period before when we looked at the history of Nintendo in general in episode 144, when we looked at their very first gaming system, which was the Color TV Game 6. And we've also explored it at various times when we looked at Gunpei Yokoi throughout the years. The laser clay shooting system was not as successful as they hoped. There was an oil crisis in 1973, and it led to a ton of orders of the laser clay shooting system being canceled, and it put Nintendo gravely into debt. So they turned the project, they miniaturized it, and they kind of transitioned it into a home toy system, so to speak. And this was a period when they were making other toys too. Now, in the Gunpei Yokoi episode, we talked about that. He made like an Ultra Hand, and there were a bunch of other electronic toys. You see, Nintendo's early history is that they found their immense success, if you'll recall, selling playing cards, right?
Right.
And it wasn't until the early 70s here that they realized the potential in electronic toys. These laser gun systems, alongside the other toys that Yokoi was making, were part of that transitional period as Nintendo really began to embrace a future in electronics as opposed to playing cards. And as they leaned into this, the president of Nintendo at the time, Hiroshi Yamauchi, created research and development divisions to focus on different projects. Gunpei Yokoi was chosen to head up Research and Development 1, R&D 1, and Uemura here was asked to head up R&D 2, which was going to be their hardware division. So R&D 2 was created, and Uemura at the team went right to work to jump into the home console market, which was skyrocketing in popularity, thanks to the release of Atari's Pong system in 1972. Nintendo wanted a piece of that action, right? The Pong system gave way to other dedicated systems, and the Odyssey was around, and suddenly everyone realized that there was a big market for home consoles. So R&D 2 was given the task to create a console that could be brought quickly to market and at a lower production cost that would equate to a cheaper console for consumers. Now, the result of this notion, which again we covered in detail in episode 144, was the Color TV Game 6, Nintendo's first console, the first in a series of first generation consoles that would inevitably become the best selling of all the first generation consoles. The Color TV Game 6 came to market in June of 1977, just months before Atari would release the Atari VCS, the system that would eventually get renamed the 2600 that we know so well. It came out in November of that year. While this is happening, arcades are increasing in popularity as well, and the golden age of arcades is literally just around the corner. Arguably, it starts with the release of Space Invaders in April of 1978, which we covered recently just in episode 197. And if you'll recall, the immense popularity of Space Invaders led to amazing growth for the arcade industry. Arcade spaces were opened solely for Space Invader arcade cabinets, and arcade cabinets began to spill out into other areas like supermarkets, bowling alleys, etc., 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 right?
Right.
And of course, other companies really took notice, and everyone started jumping into arcades, video games, etc., etc., etc. One of the companies that wanted to directly compete with Taito's Space Invaders was their competitor Namco, who answered the call with the release of a game called Galaxian. Now, Galaxian built upon the success of Space Invaders by creating another fixed shooter that was also simple to play, but technologically superior to Space Invaders in a lot of ways. Galaxian replaced Space Invaders' bitmap rendering system with a hardware sprite rendering system that basically animated sprites over a scrolling background. And this meant that it could have more detailed graphics, faster gameplay, and the scrolling they used as a scrolling animated Starfield background, which just gave it more movement and made it look better. It looked like a better game. So Galaxian was released in September of 1979, and it was immediately successful. People were buying it. Eventually, it would become the second highest grossing arcade game of 1979 and 1980. A lot of companies took notice of its success, Nintendo included. During much of this period, as arcades were growing exponentially, Nintendo R&D2 was working on variations of consoles in the color TV game line. There was a new color TV game. The first one was 1977. They released the 12 in 1978, another in 1979, and the final one in the series in 1980. So R&D2 was just taking the color TV line and rolling with it. But with this insane popularity of arcade cabinets, they were tasked once again with capitalizing on what was popular and jumping into the mix. So they were essentially said, hey, take a break from home consoles. We want you to shift into the arcade. So back to arcades they went. They designed an arcade cabinet. They based it on Galaxian itself. They analyzed the cabinet and integrated much of the higher end technology that made it special into their own cabinet, like high end memory chips and integrated circuits that were faster, all the things that made Galaxian. They basically took it apart and, in a lot of ways, copied it and said, we're going to base a game off the same technology. The result was the 1980 shoot 'em up arcade game titled Radar Scope. Cue the collective groan from longtime listeners of our podcast. Now, we've been here before in episode 48. We've touched on all of this history in different pieces, and it's all coming together today. In episode 48, we celebrated the 40th birthday of Donkey Kong. So if you'd like to learn more about how Donkey Kong came to be, go give that a listen. For our purposes today, however, you need to know that Radar Scope was released in October of 1980, just months after Nintendo founded their North American subsidiary, Nintendo of America. Radar Scope was brought over to Seattle, and there it tested well. So Nintendo of America wagered most of their corporate budget against an order of 3,000 units of Radar Scope from Nintendo company itself, the Japanese version. It sold only about 1,000 of them, and it did not do well. It was not popular. So for all purposes, it was an absolute disaster. Nintendo of America had no money left over and 2,000 useless Radar Scope cabinets in its warehouse. It was literally on the brink of financial disaster before it barely even started. Now, the president of Nintendo of America at the time, Minoru Arakawa, happened to be the son-in-law. I say happen. He was the son-in-law of Nintendo's then president, Hiroshi Yamauchi. So he went back to his father-in-law and he basically pleaded for help. He asked them to develop a new game that utilized the Radar Scope cabinets. You know, new game, new graphics on the outside, just a whole redesign so they wouldn't go to waste. They were basically looking for what's called a conversion kit to rescue the company from going under. So Yamauchi put the call out to the entire company for fresh game designs to save his son-in-law. And what ended up winning was presented to him by now one of the most famous game designers in the world, Shigeru Miyamoto, the creator of Mario, the creator of Zelda, the creator of many things that we love from Nintendo. His face is synonymous with Nintendo at this point, you know? The conversion of the radar scope cabinet ended up being his debut as a lead game designer for Nintendo. And the end result, his project, was the debut of their now mascot and most recognizable character. And the game he came up with is none other than Donkey Kong, featuring Donkey Kong himself and Nintendo's now lovable mascot, Mario. Donkey Kong was an absolute smash hit. It was their first international hit, really, and it made Nintendo a better known, I wouldn't say household really at this point, but it made Nintendo a really well known name across the world. But most importantly, what Donkey Kong did is it rescued Nintendo of America from financial ruin, and it left Nintendo itself with a $280 million surplus, basically funding their next project, which is why we're here today. It was a project that was set to revolutionize the way people played games at home. Rob, speaking of revolutionary, do you know what's revolutionized the way we consume entertainment at home?
What's that, Dave?
Podcasts. Have you, fellow listeners, ever considered making your own podcast? Do you have something clever and engrossing that you'd like to share with the world, but you don't know how? Our friends at Zencastr have created an all-in-one podcasting suite of tools that makes it easier than ever to create your own podcast.
With Zencastr, it's super easy to record a podcast. Everyone logs in using their web browser, and you just start recording a high-quality podcast right away. It allows you to record up to 4K video with your guests, and with Zencastr's multi-layered backups, you always have the highest quality recordings, even if someone has an unstable connection.
With Zencastr, you never have to worry about what you sound like. Zencastr's post-production process makes you sound buttery smooth. It automatically removes all those ums and ahs, removes those awkward pauses in conversation. You can set the right podcast loudness. You can reduce the background noise. It's just a bunch of selections, and then with one click of the button, it does all the post-production stuff for you.
And if the thought of podcasting overwhelms you because you think you need tons of different tools and services, relax. Those days are over. With Zencastr's all-in-one podcasting platform, you can create your podcast, edit it, and distribute it to major destinations, all from one place.
So, if you'd like to start your own podcast, or maybe you have one and you're ready to take it to the next level, we've got a deal for you. Go to zencastr.com/pricing and use our offer code, one word, memory card lane, and you'll get 30% off the first month of any Zencastr paid plan.
Sign up for Zencastr today, and you can experience the same ease in producing your own high-quality podcast as we do each week. Go out and share your ideas with the world.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So in a 2020 Kotaku interview titled "The Designer of NES Dishes the Dirt on Nintendo," Uemura was flat out asked, how did the Famicom project come about? It started out with a phone call in 1981, he responded. President Yamauchi told me to make a video game system, one that could play cartridges. He always liked to call me after he had a few drinks, so I didn't think much of it. I just said, sure thing, boss, and hung up. It wasn't until the next morning when he came up to me sober and said, that thing we talked about, you're on it, that it hit me. He was serious.
Nice.
Isn't that cool? Not just a cool little anecdote that he remembers the moment. So Uemura and the team at Research and Development 2 got to work. They were instructed to create a home console that would be less expensive than its competitors, yet with performance that would not be surpassed for at least 1 year. At the time, the best-selling console in Japan was called the Epic Cassette Vision, so the project began codenamed Project Gamescom with the intention of becoming cheaper and more powerful than it. Uemura said in an interview that he started by purchasing many of his competitors' consoles, taking them apart and analyzing them piece by piece. I looked at the chipsets, he said, saw what CPUs they used, and checked out their patents. This process took about 6 months. He was impressed in how he went about this, so he elaborated. I had a semiconductor manufacturer dissolve the plastic covering on the chips to expose the wiring underneath. I took pictures, I blew them up, and I looked at the circuitry underneath to understand it. It's cool, right?
Oh yeah, no, it definitely is.
I mean,
It's
it's fascinating to think of the lengths that they had to go to understand how their competitors worked at this point. Because I doubt anyone does that anymore, right? Like, there's no, they don't need to do that. Like, they order chips now. This is what we wanted to do. It's an order. There ain't no one dissolving the covering on silicone chips anymore. You know?
yeah, it's all a lot. I wouldn't say easier, but it's more accessible nowadays to get this information and make things than back then, where everything was kind of by
We have,
yourself.
yeah. I mean, we have roughly 40 years of this technology. It was microcomputers were. I mean, microcomputers were just becoming a thing, and you know, Project Gamescom was also influenced by the ColecoVision, which was Coleco's console that competed against Atari's 2600. The chief manager of the project ended up bringing a ColecoVision home to his family, which had among its other games a port of Nintendo's Donkey Kong. In fact, Donkey Kong was ColecoVision's top seller. He was impressed with the ColecoVision smooth graphics, which were in contrast to the flicker and slowdown that was commonly seen on Atari 2600 games. So, with that, the ColecoVision became the bar by which Project Gamescom was going to surpass. Wasn't the bar they set, it was the bar that they were going to leap over, right?
Right.
It inspired the team by helping them realize that it was possible to achieve better results. But it also reminded them that as good as it was, there was no console capable of handling an accurate port of Donkey Kong. And essentially, that became the ultimate goal of Project Gamescom to create a console that could accurately port Donkey Kong. Umura ended up sending engineers to meet with Rico, a semiconductor manufacturer that had previously worked with Nintendo on the Color TV game and various arcade cabinets of theirs. And of course, those engineers brought with them a Donkey Kong arcade cabinet. Rico was asked to help them build a console that was more powerful than anything else at the time, which was also going to be comparable to the Donkey Kong arcade hardware. Originally, they had considered using a 16-bit CPU to build power the system, but at the time, that technology went against the concept of build it cheap, which is one of their goals, right?
Right.
So they settled on an 8-bit CPU, and they supplemented that with a custom chip, another 8-bit chip that was created by Rico. It was a custom graphics chip that we call the PPU, our picture processing unit. So in tandem, the 8-bit CPU and the PPU was going to power the console. And Rob, just a side note, this technology was based on, at the time, it was like the 6502, it was like the 6502 technology, the MOS. It was like the popular semiconductor of the time. But Commodore had the patent to it at the time. And so basically, they flew under the radar, and these were unlicensed 6502 variants,
Nice.
right?
All I know is that Rico went on to make printers.
Yeah. As they were building out the rest of the console, there were suggestions to add a keyboard, a modem, and even floppy disk storage. Basically, turn it into a computer, but these were all rejected in order to keep costs down. They compromised, and instead of including those peripherals, they left an expansion port on the front of the console for add on versatility. Originally, the cartridges were slated to be the size of cassette tapes. That was the original design. But as we know in the end, they ended up being much bigger, right?
Right.
As they designed the cartridges, careful attention was paid to the connections, the pin connections, because their arcade machines were often plagued with loose and faulty connections. And so the care and thought put into this led to the design where it was a necessity for them to have 60 connection lines for memory and expansion. So that equated to a bigger cartridge. And speaking of arcade machines, originally the team had planned on using arcade style joysticks, kind of like the Atari does, that type of style.
Mm-hmm.
But there were concerns about their durability and some weird concerns where children might step on them on the floor.
Hmm.
So
Okay.
one of the engineers on the design team actually borrowed from Nintendo's popular handheld line, the Game and Watch line, and they attached the D-pad from the Game and Watch line to a joystick prototype for Project Gamescom. And the team found that it was easy to use, that it caused no discomfort, and so with that, the traditional D-pad controller was born. Now, in the original release of what would become the Nintendo Famicom, the controllers were hardwired to the console, actually, for cost saving purposes. Uemura also added a microphone to the second controller because he liked the idea of allowing players to voice their sound their voices through the TV, basically. And one other oddity that I thought was interesting about the design of the system, it was actually Gunpei Yokoi, the creator of that magical D-pad, that suggested that an eject lever be added to the cartridge slot. It is, in fact, Rob, not a necessity in any way, shape, or form. Did you know that?
I had no idea.
But Yokoi believed that children could be entertained by pressing it.
Wasn't wrong.
So he brought it to Uemura, and Uemura adopted the idea.
That is perfect. That's a fantastic thing.
And
Wow.
before we move on to its release, let's talk about how Project Gamescom became the Nintendo Famicom. We have Uemura's wife to thank for that, as it was she who proposed that name. When they were coming up with alternatives, they were arguing around the concept of a home computer. And she argued that the console was neither a home nor a personal computer. So the team was stuck on that concept, right? And they were coming up with all these variations on home computer, personal computer, and so on and so forth as their name for the finished project. So when she suggested that it was neither a home nor a personal computer, she instead suggested that they call it a family computer, and the Famicom was born.
Yeah, that's fitting.
So the Nintendo Famicom was released on July 15th, 1983, and right off the bat, in its first 2 months, it sold 500,000 copies. But many of those units, unfortunately, would freeze up during gameplay. Nintendo traced the problem to a faulty circuit in the PPU, the early graphics chips, and they recalled all Famicom systems just before the 1983 holiday shopping season. And they also suspended production on new Famicoms until they could fix the problem. They ended up losing millions through that holiday season because of it. Eventually, though, they released the Famicom with a new motherboard that had no faulty circuits, and it shot off like a rocket.
Yeah, I think that was the better approach.
Probably no faulty circuits.
Yeah,
That's the way you should go about it.
probably. I mean, just in my opinion.
People don't like it when their stuff breaks.
I mean, to speak for yourself, I sure don't.
True. With the immense popularity of the Famicom in the Japanese market, Nintendo was ready to break into the global market. Despite Donkey Kong making them a well known name, they were still seen as a new and unknown electronics slash console manufacturer. So there were hesitations about going out to the world by themselves as just Nintendo. Because of this, they entered into negotiations with Atari to release the Famicom outside of Japan as the Nintendo Enhanced Video System by the end of 1983. An agreement was reached, final contract papers were written up, and they were ready to be signed at the 1983 Consumer Electronics Show. However, at the show, Atari saw Coleco demonstrating a prototype of Donkey Kong for their upcoming Coleco Adam home computer system. And there was a problem with this because Coleco had licensed Donkey Kong for the ColecoVision, but Atari retained the exclusive computer license for the game. Ruh-roh.
Yeah, uh-oh.
So Atari took this demonstration as a sign that Nintendo was also doing business with Coleco. So they got nervous and they pulled out of the agreement to distribute the Nintendo Enhanced Video System. Now, in truth, the Atom computer was backwards compatible with ColecoVision games, and that's what Coleco was demonstrating. But the result was that Atari pulled out of the relationship with Nintendo and instead started focusing on the successor to the Atari 2600, which was the Atari 5200. And I read a funny interview with the lead engineer at Atari at the time who regrets not moving forward on that relationship with Nintendo, obviously.
Yeah, probably hurt him a little bit.
So Nintendo was able to do damage control and clear this little miscommunication up. But as we know it, the North American video game market crashed in 1983. And as a result, Atari started to have financial problems. As a result, that deal was killed in the end as they just lost the financial ability to do that. The video game crash of 1983, which we've done a whole episode on, destroyed the American public's confidence in video games more than anything. And research conducted by Nintendo, market research, warned them to stay out of the US home console market. Retailers considered video games to be in decline, a passing fad, and they reduced their inventories of anything video game related. And although by this point the golden age of arcades were a little about to be behind us, players were actually still showing up to arcades for new games. So in 1984, Nintendo secretly introduced North American audience to the Famicom hardware in the form of the Nintendo Versus System arcade cabinet. The Versus System arcade cabinets were literally just the hardware of the Nintendo Famicom shoved into an arcade cabinet. There was a few modifications to make it an arcade cabinet, but it was basically the Famicom hardware, Rob. The majority of games that were released on this platform are conversions of Famicom and later NES games. Funny enough, the Versus systems, they were not popular in Japan, and because of that, Nintendo eventually pulled out of arcade development. In contrast, the Versus system was incredibly popular in the United States. It was versatile, it was cheap, which was probably why it was so popular in the United States, and it could be easily converted because they literally just had to convert the hard, it was a Famicom, just pop in a new cartridge. Not quite the way it's designed, but you get what I'm saying. Easy conversion, right?
Right.
In fact, you should know that the Versus system was the highest grossing arcade cabinet for all of 1985 in the United States. So it was popular. The popularity of the Versus system gave Nintendo back its confidence in the US market, and its popularity convinced them to push forward on their plans to release a Famicom again in North America. So the Famicom, a version of it, first appeared again in 1984. To avoid being associated with what they perceived as a still stagnant home console market, the family computer was literally redesigned to be just that. And it was presented as a full home computer setup called the Nintendo Advanced Video System. It was complete with a keyboard, a cassette data recorder, and a basic software cartridge, pretty much like the Commodore and the Atari PCs. It was that for all purposes. It still couldn't break the mold, with the media reporting that video games were dead. One of them asked the readers, "Hasn't anyone told Nintendo that the video game industry is dead?" It people were just not having it. So Nintendo quickly realized that this wasn't going to work either. So they went back to the drawing board, intent on designing something that would not resemble a video game console whatsoever. The home computer approach was scrapped and it was completely redesigned. Nintendo of America's marketing manager at the time, Gail Tilden, was very careful to avoid any terms associated with a game console. So console was changed to game deck, or control deck rather. Cartridges became game packs, and the whole setup was coined the Nintendo Entertainment System. So our system, the NES, was born. Nintendo Company Japan sent over a prototype to Nintendo of America. Nintendo of American designers Lance Barr and Dot James were disappointed with what Nintendo sent them. They nicknamed the prototype the Lunchbox. In response, they redesigned it. They added a two-tone gray to the plain box they were given. They added a black stripe. They added red lettering to add to the notion of not wanting to be a video game console. They moved the top loading slot of the Famicom to a front loading slot on the NES, hoping that people would more so associate the Nintendo control deck with a VCR as opposed to a video game console. And of course, my favorite change, they moved the hardwired controllers and replaced them with custom sockets to have detachable wireless controllers, or wired controllers. You know what I mean.
Yeah.
Nintendo of America still had a mountain to climb. You know, confidence in the console market was still at an all-time low. So they added to the notion that the NES was an entertainment system by positioning it more so as a toy amongst retailers. They emphasized some of the add-ons like the light gun and Rob, the wireless toy robot, and how they could be added to the get up as entertainment for your liking. So, toy, right? Not a video game system. The NES is a toy.
I mean, it makes sense.
It does. Despite people flocking to Nintendo's booth at the Consumer Electronics Show in 1985, no retailer signed up to distribute the console in any way, shape, or form. Not wanting to accept defeat, wanting to, because that's not in Nintendo's culture, right? You don't take positions of weakness. That's not in their culture whatsoever. So, not wanting to accept defeat, Nintendo created what they called, it was a 12-person Nintendo SWAT team. And many of the people that we've already talked about thus far were tasked with delivering the debut of the Nintendo Entertainment System itself, even with not having any retailer support. So the engineers, the marketing manager, Tilden, Uemura, Nintendo of America, Arakawa, not Uemura. Uemura didn't come down, but Nintendo of America and Arakawa came down. Like literally a lot of the names, the people that, were created it and everything, they were all a dozen people deep team that was going to try to launch a new gaming system with no retailer support behind them. And what's typically done when you launch something like this is you do a test launch in a cheaper mid-sized city. But Nintendo was throwing it all in, so to speak. They gave the SWAT team a budget of $50 million and they said, go launch it in New York City. So they didn't pick a cheaper mid-sized market. They picked United States' biggest market, right?
Right.
Pushing the toy robot Rob allowed Nintendo, the NES, to be reclassified as a toy. And they telemarketed and they did shopping mall demonstrations and they kept at all of this, pushing these toys on retailers until the retailers started to relent. But that's not all. That's not really why they relented. Why they relented is a huge gamble that probably genuinely changed gaming history forever. In addition to all that work they were putting in, without telling Nintendo themselves, so they did not report this back to headquarters in any way, shape, or form, the SWAT team took a huge gamble and they offered retailers that they will handle all of the setup in stores and all of the marketing. They would extend 90 days credit on all merchandise and accept returns of all unsold inventory. So, in layman's terms, retailers would pay nothing for the merchandise, and 90 days later, they would either pay for what they sold or they would return unused inventory. So, Nintendo was assuming all of the risk. All of the risk. And with that, retailers began to reluctantly sign up one by one with the SWAT team, with one famously telling them, "It's your funeral."
Hmm.
It was not easy. The team did everything for the release of the NES, supporting it through the holiday season. Don James once said it was the longest and hardest I ever worked consecutive days of my life. And on top of that, there was plenty of anti Japanese sentiment at the time. While unloading their products into stores, the Nintendo of America crew was confronted by strangers who resented any Japanese influenced company in a time of international trade issues and basically what they perceived as cheap Japanese clones, right? Of, cheap Japanese products. A security guard reportedly told him, "You're working for the Japs. I hope you fall flat on your ass."
Wow.
Gail Tilden said, "I remembered one woman coming up to me, and I don't know what sparked her to do this, but she came up to me and said, 'Nintendo, that's a Japanese company, right? I hope y'all fail.'"
Jeez.
Technically, through their hard work and this right here, the Nintendo Entertainment System technically launched in the United States on October 18th, 1985. In those last 9 weeks of 1985, they sold about 90,000 units with everything, packaging, shipping, delivering, everything being handled by that 12-person team. They were doing everything out of a little warehouse in Hackensack, New Jersey. 90,000 units was successful. For all purposes, it was a successful launch. And that encouraged them and Nintendo proper to roll out the Nintendo Entertainment System nationwide throughout 1986. They started with Los Angeles in February of 1986. It was followed by Chicago and San Francisco in the months that followed. In fact, the Nintendo Entertainment System didn't actually get a proper nationwide release until September of 1986, almost a year later. Throughout that year of October 1985 through, 1986, Nintendo sold 1.1 million NES consoles. So they were probably correct to be encouraged.
Yeah, I would think so.
In the end, as we know, the Nintendo Entertainment System rolled out to more countries, eventually selling 61.91 million units throughout its entire lifetime. Now, Rob,
Yeah.
I would argue, and we could talk about this for a couple minutes, I would argue that the Nintendo is probably the most influential video game console of all time. It saved the video game market in the United States. No doubt about that. The video game crash of 1983 absolutely destroyed consumer confidence in video games. And if Nintendo hadn't forced their way in with a quality product, that's a key. We'll talk about that in a second. If they hadn't forced their way with a quality product, who knows what would have,
Yeah, that's a good point. I can't argue that it was influential because it definitely was.
Now, one of the things that Nintendo did was very smart is, or not smart, depending on how you look at it, was they locked people out of their console, right? The NES has a lockout chip. The Famicom doesn't, but the NES has a lockout chip. and only Nintendo could provide the lockout chip. So only companies that licensed through Nintendo and paid their fees for cartridges could make games for the Nintendo Entertainment System. So Nintendo basically had all the say in what was released on the system. And to add to this point, they turned that concept into the Nintendo official seal of quality. And that was done very directly to combat that sentiment that video game manufacturers did not care about the quality of their games on their systems. That was a direct result of the video game crash.
Hmm.
And it worked. I mean, let's be
Yeah.
honest. It worked. We've talked time and time again about how Nintendo didn't let certain games, they didn't like sex, they didn't like violence. They wanted the Nintendo position consoles to be very family oriented, and so they controlled what was released on it to that end, right? Um, and there have been some interesting stories about when companies have tried to circumvent that. Atari tried to do it, and they ended up in court. And then we did a whole episode on a company called Wisdom Tree, which was a Christian video game manufacturer that also subverted the lockout chip. We talked about some other companies that did it in that episode, so go check that out if you want. Not only did the NES kind of save the video game industry in North America, but there are so many iconic franchises that got their start here, right? The Nintendo franchises, Mario and Zelda and Metroid, for example. Some of the most iconic characters in video gaming, period, all started here, right? I mean, arguably, Mario is the most iconic figure in video games, and it definitely got its start. I mean, the first Mario game, Super Mario Brothers, was here. The game that basically made him a household name. So, I think in a lot of ways, to me, and it's nostalgic too, because like I've said before, my earliest video game memory is of playing baseball on the NES. But to me, it's the most influential console of all time. I think it basically saved our industry from the brink of ruin and helped set quality standards. And heck, it was the first system that really leaned into third party licensing, with the quality seal too. So, they also established that long standing concept of third party licensing and the fees associated with it and so on and so forth that has pretty much still went on to this day. So I don't know, there's a lot of reasons, but um the NES is, I don't know, it's fantastic. I love it. So
Yeah, no, like I said, I can't disagree. It definitely changed a lot, and obviously, it's probably what saved video games and started bringing them back.
definitely started bringing them back. Most definitely started bringing them back. For me, it's definitely a transition. Like in my mind, the NES is the transition between, and this sounds weird, but to me, it's the beginning of the modern video game era in a lot of ways. I think of and it might just be me personally and nostalgia, but I think of everything before the Nintendo as being like early video game history. And I think to me, the Nintendo is when the modern era started. And I don't really know why that is, but that's how it works in my mind, to be honest with you. And it might just be before me, after me. That might be why it works that way. But I don't know, for whatever reason, that's the start of the modern video game era to me. So the Nintendo is holds a lot of things for me personally. Well, we covered a lot in this episode, and there are a lot of other stories that go into this. There's a lot more that you need to learn about the creation of Donkey Kong. There's a lot more that you can learn about Gunpei Yokoi. The early history of Nintendo we did in an episode. Their first console, the Color TV Game 6, that's when we learned about the history of Nintendo. There's a lot more history that we only got to briefly touch on. It's a really fascinating story, even here, but when you start to put it all together in its entirety, you learn so much. So I would really encourage everyone to go check out all of those older episodes. You can, of course, do so by going to our website, which is www.memorycardlane.com. Rob, what else can people find on our website?
Well, you can find a calendar of our future episodes. You can find a link to our Discord where you can hang out with Dave and I. You can find a link to our Patreon where you can help support us, get access to ad free and unedited versions of our episodes. And you can find links to our social media where I am on several platforms as Rob underscore O underscore Raptor and Dave.
I can be found on various platforms as David underscore is underscore wrong. Each week, we tell you one story relevant to the current week of gaming history. This week, we learn all about the creation of the Nintendo Famicom and how it was turned into the Nintendo Entertainment System here in North America and elsewhere. While telling you each story, we hope to teach you something new about the topic, what it took from the world as its inspiration, or what it perhaps gave back to the world as its legacy. So every week, when I sit down to do my research for an upcoming episode, I inevitably learn new things. That's my favorite part about doing this. When I sit down on a topic, what is something that I did not know about that topic? And in turn, that makes me excited to share it with all of you. And that's the cycle, right? Research, new topic, let me share it with everyone. So, in celebration of this whole concept of teaching and learning, every week we like to talk about what we've learned with every subsequent topic. So, Rob, what did you learn today?
I think my favorite takeaway is probably that the start of the D pad was just because they were afraid kids were going to step on a joystick. Like, that's, you know, it's not anything I'd ever even thought of at one moment of my life. Like, a giant stick's coming up out of the ground, you're just going to step on it and break it. But, you know, I guess crazier things have happened. So that's where we got the D pad. And we still have joysticks. They're just not quite as Atari like.
No, and they did eventually make a proper arcade stick for the NES. It was called the NES Advantage, and I think is it a six button? It might only be a three button, but it's an actual it's an actual arcade joystick for the system. So they did eventually make it.
Yeah, but it wasn't the standard controller. And it's also kind of weird to know that they were originally hardwired. Obviously we were used to it being removable and you could change the controller type, between the zapper and the regular controller. And it's just weird to think that there was a time where that wasn't the case and you might have just, if your controller broke, you're SOL.
True, very very true.
So that's it for me. What about yourself, Dave?
I never knew how much work that they put into bringing the Nintendo to the United States. And that was easily the most fascinating part of this story for me. I didn't know any of it, to be honest with you. This was all new to me. The Versus hardware, I knew it was the Famicom, but I never thought about the fact that that's how they snuck it into here to test things out. I had never seen the weird Nintendo computer versions before because I had never really had a reason to look. So seeing a, you know, two tone, well, it's not really two tone, it was gray, but seeing a computer keyboard and cassette drive and all that was Nintendo themed was kind of weird. Um, and then, like I said, most of all, I didn't know the risks that they took. I didn't know that they had their SWAT team. I didn't know the big risks that SWAT team took. That could have fell. It think about like how risky that was, and it could have failed and bankrupted Nintendo of America all over again. You know.
Yeah, that is a lot of risk they took on, and it's fortunate that it worked out. But just to know, like, hey, they're dishing out all the money. Their guys are out there peddling this stuff themselves.
And that's the other point. It was not an overnight success. You know, we think about it now, we think about the immense popularity of the Nintendo Entertainment System, and to all of us who came in after it, even me for that matter, because I was around right when I was born right when it came out, all we see is the fact that Nintendo is one of the most successful consoles of all time, right? But it was not an overnight success. It took a lot of work. It took 12 people for months upon months doing everything without knowing that the end was in sight. Like the Nintendo of America gave it their all to make the Nintendo Entertainment System a thing. And in the end, they were rewarded hand over foot. I mean, it is literally one of the most iconic, if not the most iconic system of all time. But just to think of how close that it wasn't and all the effort that they put in was easily the most fascinating part of this story to me because I honestly had no idea. I had no idea. I had no idea it was not an overnight success. So that was really fascinating to me.
Yeah, it is pretty awesome.
So it was a good story. I really was really excited to tell that. I was really excited to tell that one. If you could tell, I just jumped right into it. I think that's a really fascinating story.
Yeah,
All right.
I agree. Definitely we're excited, Dave. But, like you said, this is your earliest gaming moment, so it's got a lot of influence in your life.
It sure does. It sure does. I still think nostalgic wise, we've talked about it before, the Super Nintendo era is my era, but there's still a lot of nostalgia around the NES too, because those are my earliest memories. So, all right, Rob. Well, I think that'll do it for the story of the Famicom. There is a whole, I mean, I could really do a whole other episode on parts of the story, but, we try to keep it down to an hour a week. So here we are. I would encourage you, if you found this fascinating, to go read up on some of it yourself. There's lots of books out there, how Nintendo saved the gaming world, and Power Up, which is that same book, and there's just a lot of books around this concept, this time period. I'd really encourage you to do some reading. It's super fascinating. But with that being said, Rob, before I look ahead to next week, is there anything else that you would like to add to today's episode?
I want to take a quick moment to say thank you to everyone for listening. We hope you enjoy getting to learn about these awesome games or consoles or whatever our weekly topic is, and that you get a chance to learn like Dave and I. So thank you for joining us week in and week out.
Thank you for joining us indeed. All right, fellow retro gamers. That wraps up our deep dive into the creation of the Nintendo Entertainment System and its absolutely monumental impact on the gaming industry. I hope that you've enjoyed our little nostalgic trip down memory card lane and learned a thing or two about how Nintendo actually did save the world of gaming. Next week, though, we are leaving this 8-bit wonder behind and taking to the skies. Get ready to engage in high speed aerial combat because we're going to explore the classic arcade hit Afterburner. We'll dive into the innovative technology behind its arcade cabinet, the adrenaline pumping gameplay, and the legacy it has left in the arcade world. So join us again next week as we soar through the clouds of nostalgia and celebrate the game that made us all want to be fighter pilots on yet another trip down memory card lane. Do the thing.
Scooby Doo Dap Dap Nintendo Doo Wap Bap Ba Doo Dap.